Okay, this is Political Science 101. This is going to be Thursday's lecture, October 15th. Before I get into the substance of the lecture, before I address myself to the slides that are associated with this day, this class, I want to go back to what I said last time and merely reinforce the point that I made in the last lecture, which hopefully you viewed by now. And if you haven't, well, that's okay because I'm going to be making this point again, and it's an important one. So I offered you a proposition, a choice, and the choice was a fairly simple one. It was whether or not you think that continuing along with this particular mode of instruction, i.e. using YouTube as a means of conveying the lecture, is that maximally conducive and optimally suited to your particular pedagogical interest as a student? Is that the most efficacious and expedient and effective and efficient means of conveying the substantive material of this course? That's a rhetorical question, all right, but it's one that I want you to ponder and contemplate. And in your introspective reflection on that, I want you to ponder and contemplate and reflect upon the alternative option, which I'm going to propose now. If you don't think that this is maximally conducive to your interest as a student, then the other alternative is that we could conceive, or I could conceivably, what I could do is I could embed audio files in your existing PowerPoint slides, the PowerPoint slides that I send out every couple of weeks. And what you would essentially have, therefore, is my commentary, whatever comments and thoughts and insightful ideas that I happen to think of as I'm looking at the slides, you would have that audio anyways, contemporaneous with your viewing of the slides themselves. And that may, in some ways, that may consolidate and make more concise or streamline the process of learning and make it resonate more effectively with you. I don't know, all right? I don't know how your mind works. I don't know whether or not that's actually true, what I just proposed there, but it may be. And it may also be the case that you may find that these videos are actually not particularly valuable, right? I hope that's not the case because it doesn't, the scenery and the aesthetics of the environment doesn't really matter one bit. Whether or not I'm sitting here in this chair wearing Walmart's finest or wearing that security jacket that I wore last time, that doesn't matter at all right? And what I'm doing, whether I'm gesticulating wildly, when I'm walking around the room, none of that matters, right? What I really think matters is what I say, okay? And if that's all that really matters, if that's the takeaway, if you will, if that's the substrate, okay, that is most substantial and most significant and most imperative for your interests as well as mine, then I submit to you that everything else about this, the aesthetics and the visuals, therefore, is superfluous. It's superfluous vis-a-vis your interest as a student to learn. That would be the point that I would make. Now, you could say, well, Jeff, why aren't you proposing Zoom or Skype? And is the reason that you're not proposing that because you have an aversion for getting up early and therefore you don't want to have to do anything that requires you to actually engage with us at a time that is contemporaneous with our scheduled class time? No, that's not the reason why. The reason why I don't think Skype or Zoom or any other means of simultaneous virtual engagement would be more efficacious than YouTube or my just recording these lecture videos and then or lecture audio recordings and embedding them in the audio in the PowerPoint slides. The reason why I don't think that would add anything to the experience is because what would that offer you an opportunity to do that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do if you were just using the YouTube means of lecture instruction or in fact the audio files embedded in the PowerPoint slide? Well, that would offer you the opportunity to actually engage with me in some sort of dialectical exchange. Now, I don't want to dismiss that categorically, but I would say that seems to me not to be a very salient concern for any of you because in my experience thus far with this class, it doesn't seem to be that we have much of an exchange. It's mostly me either coming to our physical class back in the Copper Country Center 104, or me obviously sitting in this isolated, lonely room here and talking to myself. But either way, I'm talking to myself. All right. And granted, some of you have asked questions. All right. A few of you, I think two of you have asked questions. And not very many, not very frequently have you to ask questions. But the more the merrier, right? But that just underscores the point that I'm trying to make, which is to say that if there are no questions, then it's not a dialectical exchange. It's not a dialogue per se. It's a monologue. Okay. It's unilateral. It's not bilateral. It's one way. And if it's one way, then why would we need to necessarily create transition to a learning mode, a modality of instruction, which creates the opportunity for a two-way bilateral exchange if we never really rely upon that, if that's not something that is imperative for our understanding of the material, and it's not something that is important to you, because thus far you've evinced a, maybe not a disdain for that, but an apathy towards it. So that's the point that I would make about Zoom and Skype or any other mode of simultaneous virtual interaction. So I'm going to just go ahead and sort of dismiss those as a matter of course, because I don't think that they add anything that would be of material advantage. They wouldn't confer any material advantage to any of you, nor would they confer any material advantage to me. So the choice is, it's an easy, well, I don't know if it's a simple choice, but I don't know if it's an easy choice, I should say. It's a simple choice, because it's either continue along with the YouTube videos, if this is fun, right? If you don't have any serious grievances with respects to how I comport myself and the form in which this takes and the backdrop here and, the aesthetics of it, and I don't think that would really be grounds for complaint. But if it is, and if it's a superseding concern, then of course let me know. But if you think that this is problematic and you think that this is in some ways inhibitive of your learning the material, then perhaps your preference would cause you to gravitate towards the alternative option, which I'm proposing, which would be in fact PowerPoint slides with audio files embedded in them. And again, I think the advantage to that, to my mind anyways, would be to have my verbally articulating the information at a time which is contemporaneous with your viewing of the actual material that is on the slide. Now, I'm presupposing that all of you actually have the slides in front of you as you're listening to this. So maybe that suggestion doesn't really have much weight or much probative value, or it's a moot point, because you're already getting that value. You're already deriving that value. But maybe it's the case that you're distracted because you want to see what I'm doing, right? You want to watch me as I'm talking, and then therefore your attention is taken from otherwise being able to devote yourself exclusively, all the cognitive overhead, dedicating that exclusively to the viewing of the PowerPoint slides while just merely hearing what I have to say about any given slide. So that's the proposition. Take it or leave it. But thus far, only one of you has actually given me any sort of constructive feedback on that. I appreciate the response that this individual was kind enough to provide me with. But let's just put it this way, if I don't receive some sort of majority consensus, and for this class, because there's only 7 of you enrolled in this class, that would be 4, right? So if I don't receive 3 more responses, if I receive 3 or fewer responses that are indicative of what your preference is going to be, then I'm just going to go ahead and decide. I'm going to go ahead and utilize my professorial discretion and determine unilaterally, if you will, what the best mode of instruction is going to be henceforth. Now, this may not be particularly important, because this mode of instruction, this contingency plan, having to rely upon YouTube or audio files embedded in a PowerPoint slide, this may all be over with within a very short time. I can hope for that. We can all aspire for that to be the case. But I can say this, it is conceivable that I may not actually be back in the physical class next week. And the reason I say that is that's going to be contingent. That's a decision that is contingent upon factors that are completely beyond my control, but the considerations that I think are going to be operative in the decision are going to be what's going on in Houghton County epidemiologically in the next 4 or 5 days. And if the cases continue to go up and it continues to have a sustained rate of new cases, and that's a trajectory that just continues to go up consistently, and by the way, my parents are going to be there until about the 24th of the month, then I don't think that it would be prudent for me to make the decision to come back. I think that would be callous. I think that would be unethical. I think that would be morally unconscionable. I think there would be a lot of things that I've already talked about, and therefore I would delay returning until probably about the 24th or the 25th of this month, which would take us to week 11 or whatever that's going to be. That's 2 weeks from today. So yes, it is conceivable that we could continue to rely upon this for at least another 2 weeks. Okay. Well, I should say not at least. Hopefully at most, but I can't say that because we don't know what the health department is going to decide to do, and they may very well come to the college and say, you guys got to take another 2 or 3 weeks off. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully, for your interest, assuming that you guys actually value the interpersonal exchange that happens in physical classes, I don't know. But anyways, that's my proposal to you. Take it or leave it. like I said, I don't care either way. I can do either or. It's not like one is any more difficult or challenging or onerous for me than the other. So, but this is all about deferring to the will of the people. As I think I've said on many instances before, I believe that I am your employee, functionally speaking, and therefore I want to give you guys some discretionary control over the form in which this course takes. Not necessarily the substance, right? The content itself. That's for me to decide. Well, that's actually for the college to decide, and then that's for me to either adhere to or deviate from accordingly. But the form, right, the method, if you will, the methodology, I'm going to give you guys some control over, and I think that's in principle that's the way it ought to be done. Whether or not it's actually done that way, I don't know. That's not my business, but that's the way it's going to be done in this class. Okay, that's that. The final point that I wanted to make with respect to sort of following up on what I said last time, right? And this is just a segue into the material that we're going to talk about today. I finished off trying to close escrow on Jefferson's writings that took the form of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And the very last thing I was talking about was the final paragraph in that particular document. And I don't know if I was especially lucid or coherent on this particular point, and I don't know whether or not it actually resonated with you in a way that made some sense intelligibly. So I'm going to make that point one more time. I'm going to make it more concisely and hopefully more precisely, and therefore hopefully in a way that is more conducive to your full understanding of it, because it's an important point. So the thing that I found to be problematic with Jefferson, right, and this is one of the few things that I found to be problematic with him, but what he says essentially is that all the legislative bodies in Virginia, and he's talking about the different legislative bodies that meet at different times, right? So you have the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is their unicameral parliament. It's their Congress essentially, right? The state Congress, the state House of Representatives, right? That's what it is, okay? And it meets at different times, right? I mean, you have different constituent members who comprise that particular body, okay? Because they're elected every 2 years, right? They're up for re-election or they lose that, and then somebody else gets. So the composition of the House of Representatives for Virginia at the time changes, okay? And what Jefferson is saying that, regardless of the fact that it changes, okay? So different people come in there and, they become the new members of the House of Burgesses. Regardless of the composition, okay, the members of the House of Burgesses have to assume that each of those sessions of the Congress that represents the interests of the citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia, each of those sessions has to be given the same powers and the same rights and the same responsibilities as any other that either comes after it or comes before it, right? And because they have the same powers and because they have the same responsibilities, then we have to treat them as co-equals, okay? We have to treat them as co-equals. And one of the powers that is vested in the Parliament or the Virginia legislature at this particular time, the House of Burgesses that they refer to it as, is the power to repeal or amend amendments that were promulgated by a previous House of Burgesses, a previous meeting of the Congress, right? So you have the power of subsequent Congresses. This is true of the United States Senate. This is true of the United States House of Representatives. It was also true of the Virginia House of Burgesses, of which Jefferson was a member. That they have the right, they have the power to repeal certain laws that were codified by previous legislative bodies. They have the right to repeal those if they find them to be distasteful or they find them to be incongruous with the interests of the citizens they represent or whatever reason, right? But then he goes on to say, when he's talking about his Virginia statute, the eponymous title of the document itself, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he says, but even though we're going to accord each and every one of these various legislative bodies that comes sequentially in time, we're going to accord them equal powers. And amongst those powers is the power to repeal and amend previous legislation that came before. This particular Congress that's sitting now with me, Thomas Jefferson, as a constituent member of it, we are going to promulgate this Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and it is going to be unassailable. It is going to be not subject to repeal or amendment or adulteration or modification of any time from henceforth, subsequently. So he's saying, on one hand, he's saying that, well, all the legislative bodies that convene in Virginia under the auspices of the House of Virginia, they have Virginia House of Burgesses, they have equal powers, they have equal authority, they have equal prerogatives. And amongst those powers, one of the constituent powers that they have is the power to repeal and amend legislation that comes before, right? But then he's also saying, but this Virginia statute for religious freedom that I, Thomas Jefferson, am the author of, and that I'm going out there and advocating for, and I'm soliciting votes for, right? This has such preeminent penultimate significance. Okay, and I think the way that he qualifies it, the prose that he used, is to say that well, this is something that addresses itself to fundamental inalienable human rights. Okay, it addresses itself to inalienable rights of the constituent citizens of Virginia, and therefore, by using that particular qualifying language, therefore he's essentially inoculating this particular statute against subsequent attempts to repeal or modify or amend it. Okay, now I don't know about you, but it seems to me that he's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to say that, well, we got to respect and defer to and give equal power to all legislative bodies that come, regardless of when they're convened, regardless of when in time they're going to happen, right? But yet this particular legislative body, of which I, Thomas Jefferson, am a constituent member of, and which I'm advocating for a particular legislation to be promulgated in, right? This particular legislative body has the preeminent capacity to promulgate or codify laws that are not actually subject to repeal or modification or adulteration or amendment by subsequent bodies, right? Now that's in flagrant contravention or contradiction to what he just said about the rights and the prerogatives and all legislative bodies being co-equals and essentially being created equal. Well, no, it seems to me that he's saying, well, his legislative body is more equal than the others, right? That he has greater rights, that the body that he is a constituent member of has greater rights and greater powers because certain acts that they promulgate, certain laws that they enact, have greater weight and are impervious, are irrefutable, right? Are irrefragable, are there for all time. As long as you qualify this particular act as saying, well, this has this connotation about it, it's addressing itself to human rights and basically inalienable, fundamental rights. Well, therefore, it's not susceptible to repeal or amendment. I hope you see that point. Okay, I don't know how I can make it any more explicitly than that. And maybe Jefferson maybe he articulates it more lucidly than I am, right? But I think he uses a prose that's more synonymous with the prose that Shakespeare uses. So I'm trying to, I won't say dumb it down, but I'm trying to articulate it in a way that resonates with you guys and resonates with your, our contemporary 21st century sensibilities. So hopefully that is coherent. Okay, the final point I would make is the analogy that I tried to draw between the old school, the original Tea Party, the perpetrators of the Tea Party, because they really were perpetrators, they're co-conspirators who were responsible for that act of criminality. The analogy that I was trying to draw on, okay, and I hope that this is intelligible for all of you, is that what I don't think you can say, okay, well here's the principle of the Tea Party. Here's the Tea Party principle. If I had to articulate it, here it is. Right. So what you would essentially say is, if you are following in the footsteps of the founding, you can't say the founding fathers, but the patriots, let's just call them, right? At that time contemporaneously, they were viewed as patriots, right? The principle of the patriots, right, or in my estimation, the conspirators who were responsible for the Tea Party, the vandalism of the Tea Party, the criminality, the principle that they stood for is to essentially say that if there is a fundamental right that is being violated, or that is being subject to mitigation or compromise or adulteration or obfuscation or whatever, right? That this right is being disenfranchised from us, or is dispossessed of us, or has, or rather that there is a right that we ought to have an entitlement to, right? That we as citizens have an entitlement to, that this is a God-granted, divine, inalienable right that is inherent and invested in us fundamentally, right? And yet it hasn't yet been vested. This right hasn't been consummated because the Parliament or the legislature or the Congress has not got around to actually conferring this right upon us, and therefore consummating it in the sense that it's actually been validated and legitimated. If that right hasn't been legitimated, if that right hasn't been validated, or if it's a right that has been validated and it's being dispossessed of us, right, that you're trying to disenfranchise us from this particular right, you're trying to alienate or dispossess us of this right, then the Tea Party principle says that therefore you have the right, or you have the obligation, the prerogative, the duty to go out there and to engage in unconventional means of civil disobedience and indeed civil disorder. Because civil disobedience is going out there and standing in front of the highway, right? Standing in front of US 41 there with a sign that says, F Biden, okay, or something like that, right? You're going to block traffic. And you're going to say F Biden, down with Biden, down with Harris. They're disgusting, they're despicable, they're degenerate, and I'm not going to leave this here spot until the Michigan State Police or the local law enforcement comes here and forcibly evicts me from this particular spot in the middle of the highway, right? That would be civil disobedience, right? Now, civil disorder, okay, civil disorder is different, right? Civil disorder is actually going out there and engaging in acts that are criminal in nature, okay? Now, I think that the Tea Party philosophy, or the Tea Party principle, as I would express it, is to say that civil disorder, in addition to civil disobedience, because that's sort of a lesser form of resistance, but a higher threshold is civil disorder, right? Because that's going out there and rioting and making Molotov cocktails and bringing your Kalashnikov with you and whatever else you're doing, right? Tipping over, burning police cars, looting, pillaging, destroying the local Target store. Well, you can do all of those things, according to the Tea Party principle, so long as the right that you are seeking to vindicate or validate or achieve for yourself, acquire, consummate for yourself, as long as that right is a fundamental right, it is so quintessentially important that to continue to do nothing, right? To continue to do nothing, or not to rise up to the level where you're actually engaged in civil disorder and you're rioting and you're engaged in looting and you're engaged in pillaging and other sort of criminal malfeasance. If you're not doing that, then you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're doing all other similarly situated citizens a disservice as well, because you're not going out there and vehemently opposing this injustice that is being perpetrated by the state. Either it is an affirmative perpetration of injustice by the fact that the state is acting in a way that is directly in contravention of rights that have already been bestowed upon you, or it's sort of a latent form of injustice in the fact that the state is failing to redress some deficiency, that it hasn't actually ensured that your right is being fully protected, the right that you have that it has already conferred upon you. Or it's dispossessing you of a right, I should say. It's actually, so it's either dispossessing you of a right, a fundamental right that you have access to, right? Or it's failing to acknowledge a right that has already been granted to you, okay? It's doing one of those two things. And again, the Tea Party principle says in either of those cases, right, you not only have the right, but you have the duty, the civic obligation to go out there and raise hell and just start tearing shit up, okay? Now, I don't believe that the Tea Party principle can be fairly reconciled or logically and coherently reconciled with the notion that we are a nation of laws. That we are a nation of laws that defers to the supremacy of the laws. The laws are promulgated by the legislature. The legislature represents the will of the people. And therefore, maybe this is sort of a vicarious and attenuated argument, but you could say, in principle, therefore, that the laws represent the collective will of the people. And by going out there and engaging in civil, not just disorder, but civil disobedience, but also civil disorder, you are directly infringing upon those laws that are being promulgated by the representative body of all people. And therefore, you are offending against the other people, the other citizens who comprise the vox populi, the citizenry as a whole. So I don't know. I guess this is the argument as I'm trying to express it. Right? I'm not saying that I agree with this argument, that I'm consenting to it, or I'm conferring some legitimacy to it. I'm merely making the point that this is the structure of the argument. Right? So you got to know the structure of the argument to be able to articulate it to me. In fact, I asked about this on the test. Now, given that sort of conceptual paradigm, is it true to say that BLM is operating consistent with the ethos of the original perpetrators of the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party? Is it fair to say that Antifa, when they go out there with their Guy Fawkes masks and they go out there and tip over cars and throw Molotov cocktails and berate people and assault people and engage in other acts of civil malfeasance and criminal malfeasance, is it necessarily true to say that they are acting in a manner that is consistent with the ethos, the principles that were established originally by those colonists that were dressed up as Native Americans throwing tea over the side of a British East India Company ship? Is it fair to say that is consonant with or consistent to the principles that were originally established by the old school Tea Partiers in Boston Harbor? I would say yes, it is consistent. Yes, if that's what the Tea Party principle is, that you have this fundamental right that is being somehow compromised, either affirmatively or it's not being vested, right, in the sense that the government is not doing enough to ensure that this right is protected, and it is an inalienable right, and it is an irrefragable right, and it is a right that is vested in you as a constituent member of the citizenry, right? And then again, according to the Tea Party principle, you have the right to go out there and engage in all manner of criminal malfeasance so as to vindicate that right, so as to ensure that what you're doing again, it's not just for you. It's not for your own selfish purposes, but it's representative. It's representative of a class of citizens whose rights have not been fully consummated, whose rights have not been fully acknowledged, or whose existing rights are somehow being threatened or disenfranchised from there, or dissociated from them because of the wantonness or capriciousness or illegality of society or culture or the government itself. Now, part of this, much of this is going. In fact, all of this is sort of. I mean, it's kind of a zero sum game in the sense that your adjudication of the righteousness of a particular cause and whether or not it's consistent with the Tea Party principle, as I have just articulated it, is going to depend on whether or not you actually think that there is an underlying issue of justice fundamental to that cause. And if you think that BLM doesn't actually make a coherent point when they say that there is this systemic racism that's endemic to this country, and we can see it manifested in the way in which law enforcement comport themselves, and et cetera, and what actually happened to that poor guy up there in Minneapolis, right? That's representative of systemic racism, right? If you can make that argument, and it's a coherent argument, and you can actually adduce some kind of empirical evidence to statistically corroborate that, well then, yeah, okay, well maybe you got a fair case, right? But even assuming you meet that threshold, right? That's the threshold argument, right? What's the next step that you have to do? What's the next stage that you have to advance to and satisfy? Well, the next stage is to say, not only do we have a coherent and intelligible cognizable cause, right, a cause of justice that we're fighting for, but it gives us the right to go out there and to engage in criminality, right? Now, do you or do you not agree with that proposition? Okay, that's the question. Okay, that is the question, right? That's the question that will probably manifest itself in the next test, right? Do you agree? Do you or do you not agree with the Tea Party principle, as I have clearly elucidated it now, right? And if you say, yes, I agree with the Tea Party principle, then what is your answer to the BLM people? And what is your answer to the people on the radical right, right, who carry semi-automatic assault rifles into the town square for the ostensibly for the purpose of threatening other citizens, or at least intimidating other citizens, to the point where those other citizens are so intimidated and so terrified that they don't actually feel as though they have the right to express their own opinions in a public venue, in a public square, which to my mind is essentially constraining their rights, right? So that's an infringement upon the constitutional rights as they've been articulated by the Constitution. So I'm saying that you can look at this through the prism of BLM or anti-FOM, but you can also look at this in the context of what the radical right is doing. You can look at this. It's true of either side of the ideological spectrum. Okay, now what you have to do is when you answer this question, you have to be consistent. All right. So if you're going to say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and concede that BLM has the right to go out there and tear shit up in Minneapolis, well, then you have to say, well, I also concede that the people on the radical right, the Michigan militia and the Texas militia and the good old boys and the neo-Confederate and the Ku Klux Klan and whoever else, they have the right to go out there with their fully automatic Kalashnikovs and their AR-15s and their M4s and whatever else, and they have the right to intimidate the shit out of whoever shows up for the BLM protest. They have that right because they're acting in accordance with a principle that was enshrined in the or incipiently inspired by the Tea Party, the guys who participated in the Tea Party. Now, I think that would be a more tenuous argument to make because they're not really asserting a right. Rather, they're ostensibly making the case that we are suppressing other people's right to go out there and to express their opinion because their opinion is so dangerous. It's fundamentally dangerous to the continued viability of our democracy. But anyways, that's the way that I would represent it. Okay, so that's sort of a continuation of what we talked about last time, but it's important to understand these things because these are the things that are most fundamentally essential to this class. Thomas Paine. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Thomas Paine. Let's talk about what his ideas actually were and what they represented. So I have this question here, or I think it's a question. I guess it's just a statement. But it says, Thomas Paine, enlightened visionary or dubious provocateur. Now, you would say, well, that's sacrilege, Jeff. How dare you insinuate or impute provocation to a man as esteemed as Thomas Paine? And by the way, I don't believe, let me see, was it Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death? No, I don't think it was Thomas Paine. That was one of his contemporaries. I wish I had thought about this before because I don't want to go and misascribe quotes. But I could see him saying that. That wasn't Thomas Paine. That wasn't Benedict Arnold either. It was it'll come to me. If you think about who said that, and we should know that because that was probably taught to you in third grade history class. Thomas Paine, the reason I say that there is this, you could construe him as either or, okay? And many of you would say, well, he's a revolutionary, right? It's his responsible by very definition, okay? If you are a revolutionary, if you are somebody who's inspiring rebellion against the existing power of the state, then you have to necessarily be a bit provocative, right? You have to be provocative with respect to your rhetoric and what you say and how you say it. Now, the reason I'm saying he's a dubious provocateur, right, and I'm arguing this is diabolus advocatus, as the Vatican would refer to it as, the devil's advocate here. The reason, and of course you guys know the reason why I play the devil's advocate, because it's the more difficult, the more challenging argument to make, which therefore is the more satisfying one when you've actually made it in a way that's convincing and compelling. What I would say about Thomas Paine, though, is that you could look at him and you could say, well, yeah, he is an enlightened revolutionary, and he wrote this thing called Common Sense. It was sort of a pamphlet. He was a pamphleteer, okay? And he wrote this pamphlet, and in Common Sense, he makes the case against the British monarchy. He actually makes the case, wittingly or unwittingly, against all monarchs. He's saying all monarchies are fundamentally flawed. There's an incipient flaw that undermines the foundation of a monarchy. The right of a monarch to rule over people. Okay, there's something that is inarguably wrong about that. Okay, that's the point that he's trying to make, and we'll get into the details of how he actually makes that point here in a minute. But what I want to say is that when you're going out there and you're producing pamphlets and you're giving speeches where you're riling up the constituency that's listening to you because you're a very potent and very charismatic speaker, and you're very eloquent, and you're very able to invigorate the passions and the prejudices of your audience, and that's the kind of person that Thomas Paine was, at least so we hear from his contemporaries. If you're doing that, is it possible to say retrospectively that, well, maybe what he was doing is, instead of going out there and acting the provocateur on behalf of a righteous cause, which he believed was a cause of justice and was a cause of the democratic interests of his fellow citizens, right? What he was actually doing was trying to rile up the people so as to become a leader of the people and therefore accrue power unto himself. Could you make that argument? Could you make that argument about any revolutionary, not just Thomas Paine? Could you make that argument about the Russian revolutionaries, Lenin and Trotsky and the rest of them, right? Could you make the argument that what they're actually doing, it may seem to some, retrospectively after the fact, it may seem to most Americans who consider themselves to be patriotic Americans, right, that what they did was resist the tyranny of the British, right? And that was, it was as simple as that. It was as clear cut as that, right? But could you conceivably look at that and say, well, when the revolution actually took form, right, when it began to metastasize, right, when it became organized, when the militias began recruiting, and when they went out there and they fought the British at Lexington and Concord, and when the new country was created, when we actually issued the Declaration, the Declaration of Independence, and we promulgated the Constitution and the various amendments therein, right, and we did all those things. We consummated the national aspirations of the people. Well, those who stood to benefit the most were people who were like Thomas Paine, those who led the charge, if you will, right? Those who were the most provocative, those who were the most exorbitant in their rhetoric. And can we therefore say that because he is Thomas Paine and those who were similarly situated to him, the other provocateurs, the other proto-revolutionaries, the other men who inspired the revolution, the American Revolution, can we say that because it was in their own personal subjective interest, because they stood to gain a great deal, right? Because who were these guys before the revolution? Well, some of them were lawyers, some of them were landowners, right? Some of them had positions of prominence and power and privilege, but many of them didn't, right? Was this a means by which they could advance themselves within the political structure of society by changing the way in which the political structure was actually organized, so as to allow for a more egalitarian assessment of people, so as to repudiate the doctrine of monarchy, repudiate the doctrine of aristocracy, and to overthrow that ancient regime, and to impose a new regime which was based more upon merit and more upon, which was an advancement was predicated upon your skills as an orator, right? As somebody who would go out there and provoke the sensibilities of the citizenry, right? Is that ipso facto in and of itself, is that advantageous for men like Thomas Paine? Well, of course it is. Of course it's advantageous, right? And again, this is going back to looking at why these guys are doing what they're doing and saying, is it completely without any subjective connotation whatsoever? Or can we look at this and can we say, can we engraft upon this some ulterior motive? Can we look into what Thomas Paine was doing, what he was writing about, and what he was recommending to the people who would listen to him? Can we say, well, what he was recommending, he was an entirely dispassionate individual. It wasn't as though he was just doing this because he believed that it was exclusively a noble thing to do, right? But he was doing it because he himself stood to benefit from it, because he himself could actually advance much more successfully through the rungs of government in a republican form of government as opposed to a monarchical form of government. And therefore, because he stood to achieve some advantage by virtue of consummating the various things that he was recommending, does that diminish or detract from or take away from the merit of his original proposition? Does that say that, well, because you stood to benefit, you have some subjective personal motivation that may have somehow contaminated your otherwise erstwhile noble and altruistic goals that you were actually advising and recommending, right? Does that diminish the efficacy of his appeal? Does it make it seem as though, well, what Thomas Paine is actually saying isn't really that legitimate, isn't really that patriotic anymore because he himself stood to benefit from that process? Well, again, the question is rhetorical, but it's one that's meant to elucidate this issue more thoroughly and provoke some thought from you on this topic. And if this was in fact the physical class, and if in fact you guys were physically here in front of me, I would be asking this question of you and hoping that somebody would give me an answer. But I suspect this is probably one of those questions that either you don't really fully understand what I'm asking about, and that's fine, because I know a lot of what I say is not fully transparent, but or it's one that maybe doesn't really readily lend itself to an easy answer. But those are the questions that are the best ones, right? Because easy questions are stupid questions, or they're not stupid questions, but they're questions that don't really offer much of an opportunity to show how creative you can be in answering them. Let's put it that way. Okay, let's add some more questions. All right, how about this? Thomas Paine on monarchy, right? So monarchy is just the notion that a king, a sovereign king, has the right to rule, and the king himself is in fact the sovereign. So now we have this notion that the state is sovereign, right? The United States is a sovereign country. Canada is Canada was actually a bad example because Canada is a dominion country, extension of Great Britain. But Mexico is a sovereign country, right? Brazil is a sovereign country, so on and so forth. And sovereignty just means that you, whether you're a country or whether you're a person, you have the right to go out there and to pursue your own interests, your own self-determination. You have the right to pursue your interests as they align with your pursuit of your own self-determination, right? Which is to say that you have the power to determine what your future is going to look like. You have the power to make decisions that are going to have implications for you, okay? And sovereignty is also sort of inextricably associated with the idea that you have the ultimate power. You are not just the head of the government or head of the state, but you're also the head of the government, right? So therefore, you have the executive authority. The executive authority is invested in the sovereign, right? Now, it's not fair to say that the president of the United States right now, or at any time for that matter, isn't in and of himself a sovereign. He's not a sovereign, right? He represents a sovereign entity, and he has the executive power on behalf of that sovereign entity, but he himself is not a sovereign, all right? Donald Trump is not equivalent to the United States. Some people may actually believe that, and for those of you who do, I'm sorry to have to tell you that that's not actually the case. Now, you could look at some countries. We could look at some countries historically, and we could say, is the head of state indistinguishable from the state itself, even though he may not be a monarch, right? Are there examples that you can recall to mind? And I think most of these are historical, but they're not all historical. Are there instances that you can recall to mind of a state that is led by a head of state who is not himself a hereditary monarch? He's not a king or a prince or whatever, right? But he is, yet nevertheless, he himself has the sovereign power, right? Because he is essentially synonymous with the state. He is the state, right? And it's usually a he, right? Because that's usually who the megalomaniacal individuals are. I can think of a few examples. Saddam Hussein, for instance. Do you think that Saddam Hussein answered to the laws of Iraq, or do you think that the laws of Iraq were subject to the caprice of Saddam Hussein? Well, I think it was the latter, not the former, right? Think about Adolf Hitler. Did Adolf Hitler have sovereign power over Nazi Germany in the 1940s, up until 1945 anyways, when he lost his sovereign power because the Soviets dispossessed him of it? Well, yeah, he had sovereign power, right? You look at Nazi propaganda, and all propaganda has some incipient truth to it. There was a German slogan. It said, Ein Reich, ein Führer, ein Volk, meaning that the people, Ein Reich is one country, Ein Führer, one leader, Ein Volk, one people, right? Meaning that all those things were sort of synonymous with each other, right? The Führer, the leader, Hitler, was synonymous with the state, and the people were synonymous with the Führer. The Führer, in other words, represented the interests of all three, himself, the people, and the state. And there were other slogans, propagandistic slogans in Nazi Germany that essentially emphasized that same point. So the notion of sovereignty, though, is the capacity of either a person, an individual, or a state through its elected representatives or through its executive or through whatever particular governmental features it has endemic to it, for a state or for a person to determine the interest, the collective interest of the people who are constituent members of that state. To determine the interests of the citizenry as a whole, right? Now Thomas Paine is saying that it's a problem when you have absolute monarchy, hereditary monarchy. He's actually focusing on hereditary monarchy, which is the idea that you have a king and he has an eldest son, and according to the principles of primogeniture, which if you studied feudal Europe, and I'm not going to assume that any of you have, right, which basically means primogeniture means that the eldest son inherits everything. Okay, it's not a very fair concept, but that's the concept that regulated the law of inheritance and wills, estates, and trusts and things like this for a very, very long time, until it was finally challenged in, I would think, probably the early 20th century, or it became questionable at that point because it was difficult to reconcile with notions of fundamental fairness and equity, and so on. And primogeniture stipulates that when you have an eldest son, not only does he inherit all the land and all the material wealth that you have, but if in fact you are the monarch, you're the reigning head of state, well, that your power, your sovereignty devolves upon, right, descends to, is vested in your eldest son. That son becomes the successor. Now, why is that problematic? Well, Thomas Paine makes a bunch of points about this, and he's not the only one to make these points. Thomas Paine is a philosopher of sorts. He's a philosopher. He's a politician. He's a pamphleteer. He's a lot of things. But he's a philosopher in a series of philosophers. There's a long philosophical tradition that goes all the way back to Thomas Hobbes, who wrote this, let's see, was it Leviathan, I believe he wrote. And in Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes talks about the monarch as the head of state. And Hobbes actually makes the point that, well, this is tangential, but I should actually say Rousseau was the one who more affirmatively sort of countermanded the notion of sovereignty vested in a monarch. But it's a point that it's a philosophical point that had been discussed and had been propagated and disseminated before. So Thomas Paine is picking up. He's standing on the shoulders of giants because other philosophical great minds who had come before him had thought about this, had contemplated this, had discussed it, had expounded and exposited on it to a greater or lesser extent. Now, some of the points that Thomas Paine makes, he says, well, first of all, think about this notion of heritability. What is problematic about heritability? The first point he says is, well, you never know what you're going to get, right? We can't always presuppose that because you are the monarch, because you are the head of state, because you are the king or whoever, right? That therefore you're and because you rule this fairly and justly and equitably, and you are a good ruler of state on the level, that therefore your son, your eldest son, is also going to take after you and is going to comprehensively assimilate himself to all the various good, beneficial qualities of a benevolent ruler that you yourself manifested when you were the ruler. Is that always the case? Well, it's not always the case. That you can't. I mean, I know there's the old axiom, like father, like son. Well, that's sometimes true. It's sometimes not true. And I can think of many instances historically, and I'm sure many of you can think of many instances anecdotally through your own personal experiences where you can say that's not actually the case. The son is actually not like the father. Maybe the son takes after the mother, right? Maybe the son didn't like the father because the father was very stern. He was a stern disciplinarian. He beat the son. And even though the father was otherwise a very virtuous individual, he caused the son to be alienated from him. And therefore, the son decided to identify himself with a different type of philosophy. So there's many intervening factors, intervening variables that could alter this calculus in a way that resulted in the son ruling in a way that was completely inconsistent with the way in which the father ruled. So there's the wild card variable, I would say, right? There's the idea that this is a very capricious process, right? And you may get lucky, you may be fortunate, you may have a son who, assuming the ruler who came before him, because that in and of itself, I don't think that's a fair assumption to make. You can't say that because somebody is ruling, right? Because he's been ruling that therefore he must have been a just ruler. That's the other problem that Thomas Paine has with the idea of a hereditary monarch, is that you can't say that just because you inherited the right, ostensibly the right to rule this people or this country or this nation or this empire or this, whatever it happens to be, that therefore you are going to be a good ruler, right? All that is saying is that you subscribe to the idea that your prerogative to rule devolves from divine right of kings. Okay, because that's the argument against. So Thomas Paine is saying this is all nonsensical. Okay, it's a non sequitur to say that you have the right to rule because your father ruled before you. Right, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, and there's really no coherent, logical semblance of an argument to actually assert that in a way that's persuasive. Now, the other side of the house says, well, actually, hereditary monarchy traces, and this is actually the argument that John Locke makes. This is the argument that sort of Hobbes makes in a rather circuitous way. But this is the argument that the conservative philosophers made for a very long time, which is to say that kings have their right, traces all the way back to the first kings. Okay, and the first kings were divinely anointed, that God essentially appointed those kings. So much of what Thomas Paine is doing is he's sort of secularizing the philosophy of government. He's interjecting this notion that, well, we should repudiate the idea that divinity has anything to do with it. Let's dissociate this notion of divinity, right? Let's not presuppose that there's this divine supernatural power that preordains who has the right and the prerogative to control the lives of all the other people, right? We shouldn't presuppose that because there's no way to authenticate that. It's a non-falsifiable hypothesis, right? You can't prove it any more than you can disprove it. And so therefore it's a very bad proposition to say that because you are the king and because you are divinely anointed, that therefore you have the right to rule over the other people. Well, how can you substantiate that claim other than to say that at one point in time, way back, 1,000 years ago, some king was allegedly appointed or anointed by God, and his right to rule was sanctified by virtue of the fact that the divinity, the divine power, the divine force of God conferred some metaphoric or metaphysical supreme justice upon that ruler. Thomas Paine is saying that is even if that were, let's assume that was true, okay? You can't prove that, right? There's no way to substantiate that claim, right? Even assuming that there's some veracity and legitimacy to that claim, there's no way to prove that, right? And even if that were in fact the case, he's further saying, even if that were, so let's assume that were true, let's assume that you could prove that, right? Even if that were true and you could prove that, Paine says, so what? Okay? So what? So you say that you were anointed by God. What is Jefferson saying about God? What is the purpose? What is the function of God, or organized belief in God, theology? What is the relationship between theology and the government? It has no relationship. There is no connection, right? There's no functional connection between organized religion and the state, right? And so, therefore, proceeding on that assumption, you could be a theist and a constituent citizen, right, of the colonies and the proto-United States. You could also be an atheist, right? You could be a polytheist. You could be a believer in Zeus and Jupiter and all the gods, right? You could be anything. Because what does divine right in kings presuppose? It presupposes that there is a Christian God and that the people who are ruled by that king all subscribe to the notion of the legitimacy of that Christian God. They all believe that whatever that Christian God mandates supersedes the laws of man. Okay, that the laws of God are up here and the laws of man are down here. And if that God, at one point in time, way back when, even though we can't really substantiate this through any clear and convincing evidence, that God anointed a king, the ancestor of our ruler right now, that king way back then was anointed by the Christian God, that therefore somehow vindicates all the disreputable and shady and unfair, unjust conduct of this modern ruler. Thomas Paine is saying that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so understand the structure of the argument, understand what it actually entails, understand the constituent features of that argument, because it's a pretty convincing one. I think it's a good one. And I'm not gonna argue the other side of the house because there's just not time for that. It's an interesting argument though. It's actually, well, I guess I could. I'll just briefly allude to it. What Hobbes, or I think this is John Locke that makes this point. He says the first king was actually Adam. Okay. Adam had the first, well, maybe not the first king, but he had regnal and sovereign authority over all creation because that's found in Genesis. And if you are somebody who subscribes to the Judeo-Christian tradition, that therefore you have to recognize that sovereignty was devolved, when it was passed on from generation to generation, and eventually it came down to us, right, in the form of the modern hereditary monarch, George V in this particular case, or Louis XIV in France, and whoever else, the Kaiser in Germany, etc. Right, but that power, that sovereignty over other man, incipiently traces its origin all the way back to the sovereignty or the regnal authority that God himself, again, the Abrahamic God, conferred upon Adam. And Adam had the right to rule over all God's creation. And all God's creation is inclusive of people by definition, because we are created by God, if in fact you subscribe to the Judeo-Christian tradition. But that's the problem, because it presupposes that, right? You gotta make that stipulation, right? You gotta get over this presupposition that, well, you believe in a Judeo-Christian God. Well, if you believe in that, well, then yeah, I guess this does sort of make a certain sort of sense. But I mean, even though it's a very attenuated argument, it's still, I guess you could say, well, maybe it's believable. It's not very plausible, but maybe, but it's still a reach. All right. So what else does Paine say about monarchy? He makes the point that having a hereditary monarch is about as sensible and intelligible and coherent and persuasive as having a hereditary doctor. Having the laws of heritability determine who's going to be the physician that's operating on you when you get into an accident and they cut up, they got the bone saw and they open up your skull, and they're going to operate on the the Abdullah, I don't know, whatever, the medulla oblongata. You see how much I know about the physiology of the brain. But let's just say this, right? I mean, if in fact that was, if it is the case that by virtue of the fact that your father was the monarch, that therefore that gives you the legitimate right to inherit that power and all the sovereign authority that's associated with that office, then by extension, right, by continuing along logically, it therefore follows that you must also say that if you are a lawyer or a skilled tradesman, a blacksmith or a carpenter, or whatever, right, a scribe or something, right, that therefore your son inherits the prerogative, the right, and the power, and all the prowess and the skills that are associated with doing that particular function properly. And that's the way we should determine who actually becomes doctors and lawyers and all the other various functionaries in civilized society. Now, Thomas Paine says that's ridiculous. Okay, on its face. Okay, prima facie, that is absurd. And the reason is, I hope, self-evident. My father is a physician. Okay, I've got this little statue of radiologist here. I didn't bring this in here just as a prop. This just happens to be sitting here. It's on his desk, and he's got. I can't show you guys this, but it's like a, I don't know. It's an antique, sort of like wall-mounted radiological view X-ray reader device, and it's got these X-rays on here. Well, anyways, the point is that my father's an interventional radiologist, and none of you would say that by virtue of the fact that my father is an interventional radiologist, that I can go to Aspirus Clinic up there in Lorium, and I can go work in the radiology department, right? And I can start reading and interpreting X-rays, lung X-rays. Let's diagnose you with emphysema or something, right? That doesn't predispose me to being a successful physician. You can't even say that I even have the qualities, the intellectual qualities that would necessarily predispose me for success in the biological sciences that would therefore enable my career in as a physician. Because I don't have those qualities. If I did, I would have gone into medical school and I'd be making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, as opposed to what I do make, which all of you already know, because I think I already confessed that travesty to you in the very beginning of the semester, right? But no, I don't have the intellectual aptitude for it. I have intellectual aptitude for other things, talking about political science and law and history and criminal justice, right? But I don't have the intellectual aptitude for it. It's just not innate in me. It's not imbued. Now, some people could say, well, yeah, I inherited the innate aptitudes of my father. I have the intellectual or analytical aptitudes that my father had. Some people have that. Some people don't, right? It depends on whether or not it's a recessive gene. But therefore, it should not be as a matter of course that you can inherit things. Now, what is the interesting thing about this argument? Okay, is the rebuttal to this argument. I don't want to say it's a refutation of it, but it's a rebuttal, and I think it's a fair point to make. Is that even though Paine is asserting that you should not have heritable doctors or heritable lawyers, by extension heritable lawyers, etc. For a long time, this is just a point I have to make because I went to law school. I have to make this point. For a long time, maybe some of you didn't know this, but being a lawyer was actually determined by doing an apprenticeship. And if your father was a lawyer, 9 times out of 10, you would do an apprenticeship under your father, and you would learn the dark arts of the law, and you would hopefully aspire to be a lawyer just like your father one day, because you would learn, you would do your training. He would supervise, you perform the tutelage under his direction, and you would assimilate yourself to all the nuance of the law. Now, in certain jurisdictions, this is a corollary point, but it's an interesting one. In certain jurisdictions, I think California and New York are amongst them. It makes sense when you actually think about it, but you can actually still learn law and actually go through and take the bar and pass the bar and be certified to practice as a lawyer in that jurisdiction. You can go and do an apprenticeship. Many of them stipulate that you also have to attend law school for a certain point of time. You have to attend law school for the first year, right? But then you can go and do an apprenticeship, right, under a supervising attorney who's actually a practicing attorney, and then he shows you how to interpret cases, how to read cases, how to analyze and interpret and apply these principles to subsequent cases, etc., and all the various things that lawyers train and learn how to do. And the reason I mention this is because it's interesting, because you guys will know who Kim Kardashian is. Ordinarily, that name is blasphemous. It's like dropping the F-bomb or the C-bomb or the N-bomb in class. I would never really usually reference that name because she's so despicable and disreputable. But she's actually, in many ways, she's redeemed herself, because she's done a lot. She's done a lot for social justice, and I think not social justice in the sense of the wokeness, but just good causes, righteous causes. But what Kim Kardashian is trying to do now, maybe some of you do know this, is she's actually aspiring to become a lawyer. But because she's too stupid to get herself into law school, because she doesn't have any education or credentials, because she hasn't done anything, she just laid around a pool all her life and made that porn video with Ray, whatever his name was. That's all she's done. That's her curricula vitae, right? Her resume says that, okay? And if that's all you have on your resume, you're not going to get admitted to Stanford or Yale or UC Berkeley or or even Thomas Cooley Law School, right? The fly-by-night operation. You're not going to get admitted anywhere. So what she's doing is she's going to do an apprentice under a supervising attorney and then aspire to become a lawyer. How would you like to have Kim Kardashian represent you in court? No, thank you. I think I'll pass. I'll take the public defender that comes pro bono from the state. Okay. So is it always true to say? Is it always true to say that the heritability of a particular job function is completely illogical, or it does not make sense to assume that certain jobs have this heritability quality to them? Well, no, it's not always true, but I think it's true in the context of governance, right? Is it true? Well, let me ask you this: is it true that, and this question is sort of a loaded question, I suppose, now that I think about it, but well, here it is. All right, here it is. Here's the loaded question. Hopefully none of you actually feel as though you're being intimidated by my fake gun here, right? Kaboom! Right, here it comes, right? There, I loaded the question. The question is, do you think that Donald Trump Jr. is going to be a good politician by virtue of the fact that his father was a good politician? Well, you can make the same argument about George W. Bush, right? Because H.W. was a good president, does that necessarily mean that W. was a good president? Well, that's an interesting case. So how about Jeb? I think nobody would agree that nobody would think that Jeb Bush would have made a good president. Donald Trump tore him asunder in the primaries back in 2016. But that's not the only reason why the guy was a bit of a douchebag. Okay. Liberty versus power. Moving right along here on the same slide here. Liberty versus power. And actually, now I think you guys don't even need the slides, because I just read this stuff off. You'll need the slides when there's a picture on the slides, and I have some interesting pictures coming up here. I got a picture of my hero, Mel Gibson, here in another slide. But liberty versus power. Is this necessarily a diametrical opposition and a zero-sum game? Voltaire on personal civil rights. What does unfettered freedom lead to? And that depends. Okay, so let's take this one question at a time, one point at a time. Is it true to say? Is it true to say that for when you have these two non-overlapping magisteria, you have these two different categories, right? They're completely separable and distinct, right? You have liberty over here, okay, and you have power over here. I can say, I mean, you could set this up in a different sort of diametrical conceptual way. You could say you have liberty over here. You have I don't know. You could have security, right? I think security is a feature or a facet or a function of power, so I think they're sort of inextricably intertwined. But let's just say you have liberty and power. Okay, is it true to say, right? Is it true to say that for when you take more liberty, you necessarily dispossess the state of power? When you confer more liberty on the citizenry, do you, by virtue of doing that, do you necessarily dispossess the state of the measure of liberty that you conferred upon the citizen, right? In other words, is it a zero-sum game? Is it this perfect sort of rational diametrical opposition, or is it more fair and reasonable to say that, well, no, actually, you can, these two things are they can coexist, right? You can have liberty and you can also have power, right? And you can find this balance between them. Well, I think that's more likely the case. Is it? I mean, think about this in terms of a modern example, right? Think about this in terms of COVID, right? Why is it that the state, the United States government, was restrained from taking certain draconian measures when they had to respond to COVID back in March? Why was it that the state couldn't just disenfranchise all of us from our constitutional rights? Well, because they're constitutional rights, because the state can't do that, because the Constitution says that they can't, right? Now, is there such a thing as too much liberty? People have this notion of liberty. They say, well, liberty is an absolute good. And I agree with that. Liberty in general is an absolute good. It's good to have certain liberties, but it's important to qualify those liberties and say, well, there's certain restrictions upon liberty. What happens if you allow people to have complete, unrestricted, unconstrained liberty? This is the point that Voltaire made, right? In a very, very simplistic way, but he said it very concisely. And I think it's a good quote. He says, "Your rights end where mine begin," okay, or my rights end where yours begin, if you want to switch it around. Right? What does that mean? Well, that means that I have certain rights, okay, that are fundamental and inalienable to me, just as you have certain rights that are fundamental and inalienable to you, right? And I have the right to go out there and pursue my interests, so long as the pursuit of my interests and my objectives does not infringe upon your right to pursue your interests and your objectives. And the moment that I begin acting in a way that is in contravention or imposes itself in a way that is deleterious to your own pursuit of your interests, well, the moment I begin to infringe or transgress upon your own prerogatives to pursue your rights, well, then I'm no longer entitled to say that I have the right to do that. Okay, so again, that's how that formulation works. It's also fair to say, I mean, I think the other thing that you can sort of contrive out of this is to say that's just another way of saying, reformulating the golden rule. That's just another way of saying, well, don't do to me what I would find to be, or I'm not going to do to you, rather, what I would find to be offensive to my own sensibilities, right? I'm going to refrain from doing unto you which I would not want done unto me, because it would be deleterious to my interests if in fact it was done to me, right? Or I'm going to do unto you as I would hope that you would do unto me, right? So it's a reformulation of the Golden Rule, the Analects of Confucius. This has been around for a very long time, for as long as human civilization has been around for. Is that true? Well, I think that's true. Okay, I think that's true about that. That is a correct statement about liberty, right? But what does that say about liberty, though? It says, therefore, that if you allow people unfettered right to pursue their own personal interests, then by definition, by implication, that is going to involve certain people having their rights transgressed upon by virtue of the fact that these people who have been given unrestricted, unfettered liberty are going to go out there and pursue their own rights without regard to the rights and the liberty interests of the people around them, right? Now, this takes me back, I think, to the philosophical argument about whether or not people are fundamentally just and equitable and selfless, or are people generally selfish and not necessarily altruistic, but they're not to be trusted, and they're nefarious, and they're instinctual, and they're impulsive, and they're impetuous, and they're all the sorts of things that we don't really hope that they be. But what would you say about this? What would you say about unrestricted liberty? Or how does your perception of philosophy, right, the philosophy of human nature, how does that interact with or control for how you would come down on this particular conception of liberty? If you believe that people are altruistic and fundamentally good and benevolent and beneficent and do selfless things for other people because that's just innate to our nature, well, then you would say, well, there's no problem with unrestricted liberty. Like, let people do whatever they want, because they're never going to act in a way that is deliberately, conscientiously in contravention of the rights of another person, because we're all good. Fundamentally, we're all good people instinctually, right? Now, is that fair to say? Because if you are a proponent of that theory, all right, and some of you are, because I think some of you, and well, I know some of you actually made this case in your response to that question on the last exam when I asked, what do you think about the nature? What is the relationship between the philosophy of human nature and your conception of the viability of democracy, something like that, right? And some of you were saying, well, I think people are fundamentally good, generally speaking. Okay, generally speaking, right? Well, what does that mean, therefore? That means that if we allow everybody to just go ahead and act in accordance with their own objectives, in accordance with their own impulses, in accordance with their own desires, right? What would that result in? What would result in what some philosophers refer to as a state of nature, right? Whereby people are free to go ahead and pursue their own interests without any restrictions upon the pursuit of those interests. What's the problem? Well, I would submit that, again, if you believe that people are altruistic and benevolent and beneficent in everything that they do, well, then you would say, well, there is no problem, right? But what really happens? What really happens is the people who have the strength and the power and the physicality to dispossess other people of their rights and their material possessions, they do in fact dispossess them of those rights and material possessions. That's what actually happens, right? And if you don't believe that that's what happens, go to a conflict zone, all right? Go to a war zone, right? Go to Afghanistan or go to Sierra Leone, all right? Or go to the Congo, okay? Or go to former Yugoslavia 25 years ago, right? See what happened in those places. People bind together, they form militias, they go around, and why would you form a militia in a time of chaos and disorder where the government has just ceased to lose its functioning power? Well, because you need to protect yourself and your loved ones, and that's intrinsically a selfish interest. All right. So this depends upon your conception of human nature, right? The idea that freedom is unrestricted liberty is a bad thing, right? Or unrestricted liberty could be a bad thing. And that could lead to negative consequences for a certain constituency, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to defend yourself against people who had the right and the desire to go out there and to act like a bunch of psychopaths. Okay, think about the COVID dilemma in the spring of 2020 as anecdotal. All right, I think I made that point when I originally discussed the philosophy of human nature, and I guess that would be a redundant point. All right, so let's talk about legislatures versus executives. Why was this conceived of in terms of democracy versus autocracy? So what is the function of a legislature in theory? Well, political theory asserts that a legislature is ostensibly going to be a representative body. It's going to represent the interests of the people. The people delegate the responsibility to represent their civic interests to an elected representative who goes and sits in a parliament or a Congress or a Senate or a House of Representatives or whatever you want to call it. Right? That's the idea of a representative delegated power is what it is. Now, what is an executive? Well, an executive is usually the head of state or the head of government who makes decisions, discretionary decisions, on behalf of that country. Now, again, that's not to say that that person is in and of themselves a sovereign individual. That's just to say that they have the power to act with some measure of discretion, and they don't have to come together and collaborate like a legislative body does. So an executive is more unrestricted in terms of its capacity to actually promulgate mandates and issue orders and impose the force of law, and in fact administer the law, because that essentially is the function of the executive. But it's not encumbered by the legislative apparatus, right? Because if you think about how a legislature works, it's about engaging in dialogue. It's about discussing the viability of certain propositions, and you have this idea of a filibuster where a member of the Congress can stand on the floor of Congress and can argue about anything they want about. They can talk about anything they want to, just to impede the proceedings, right? So as to delay and to buy time for themselves. The executive doesn't work that way. Why was this conceived of in terms of democracy versus autocracy? Why was when the founding fathers came together and they thought to themselves, right, well, how much power are we going to accord to a legislature versus how much power are we going to assign to the executive? What was it that caused them to be apprehensive about perhaps giving too much discretionary prerogative to the executive? Well, I would submit that if you look at the history up until this point in time, so we're talking about the late 18th century, the 1760s, 1770s. If you look at the history of the world, not just British history, not just colonial American history, right? But you look at the history of the world. What were executives up until this point? What form did an executive take? who were the executives who was the executive of the British Empire? Who was the executive of the Kingdom of France? Who was the executive of the Kingdom of Germany? Who was the executive of the Russian Empire, etc., so on and so forth, right? Well, they were autocratic, hereditary monarchs, is who they were. Okay, they were the autocratic hereditary monarchs. They were the kings who inherited their power from their fathers before them, and so they're in the minds of the framers of the Constitution, in the minds of the founding fathers, the guys who set about to write the Bill of Rights, the guys who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence, the guys who we revere as patriots. In their minds, because based on their own experiences in their own lives, the executive authority of the state was always vested in the monarch. And the monarch, as far as they were concerned, was a completely arbitrary administrator of the laws. This was somebody who could act capriciously and without regard for the interests of the citizenry, because there was no constitution that constrained what the monarch could do, or if there was, in the case of parliamentary or constitutional monarchy, the executive still got away with just abusing the rights of people in a way which suggested there was very limited restraint in terms of what the executive could do. So the problem here is that I don't know if it's a problem, but I think it is necessary for us to place this in the proper context in order for us to understand why the founding fathers had a fundamental aversion for conferring too much power on the executive. Because as far as they knew, and as far as their experience informed them, the executives up until now in the history of the world were all singularly, categorically, unequivocally, they were all kings. Now, what do we know about the relationship between the colonists and the patriots and the notion of kingship or monarchy? Well, we know that they felt that that was antithetical to the interests of justice and equity. We know that they thought that a king, by very definition, was going to be a very capricious ruler because he could do whatever he wanted to do. And he wasn't restrained. Okay, there was very little restraint placed on an autocratic hereditary monarch who could just go out there and promulgate laws and enact, order executions and veto legislation to his heart's content. And he was a very strong autocrat. He was a very strong executive. And so one of the reasons why the founding fathers wanted to ensure that they fundamentally restrained the power of the executive when they actually set about writing the Constitution and codifying the various divisions of government, the tripartite division of government, the judiciary, the elected representatives, and the executive. They wanted to ensure that the executive function did not have so much power so as to begin to resemble a king. Now, of course, certain of the founding fathers actually believed that that was very necessary, because you can't effectively rule a country, any country, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's a republic, whether it's a democracy. You can't rule any country unless you have an executive who is able to act in an unfettered, unrestricted manner, right? Because if he's constrained by the legislature, right, he's constrained by the assent of the judiciary, and he's always subject to second guessing and being continuously evaluated and scrutinized by these other functions of government, well, then he's not going to be able to be very effective at ruling. That's the other side of the house. All right, look at page 16, and I've got the book in front of me, and hopefully you've got the book in front of you. Look at page 16 and the author's imputation of tyranny to the British. Is that fair, just, and reasonable given the historical circumstances and the context in which we're talking about, right? So what the authors say explicitly, I'm going to read this because it's important. It's the middle of page 16. It's under the subheading. It says virtue of the American people. So they're talking about virtue in some ways being synonymous with this revolutionary impulse, right? The idea that we should go out there and we should affirmatively resist what we construe to be an infringement upon our inalienable rights, right? That's the notion of virtue as the authors have expressed it. Now, they go on to say, the Americans believed that the British effort to introduce tyranny into the colonies showed that the British government and even the British people had become corrupt. Selfishness had destroyed their traditional commitment to liberty. But America, peopled by those who had fled the old world in search of liberty, was a land where virtue still resided. So is virtue synonymous with liberty? Is virtue, this is the last point I'm going to make before I finish up, because we're coming up in an hour and 15 minutes here. Is virtue the same thing as liberty? Can you say that liberty is in and of itself virtuous? Is liberty always a virtuous thing? Well, that depends, as any philosophical proposition has to be qualified by that. Well, it depends on what you mean by liberty. If by liberty you mean you have liberty to go into Boston Harbor and to go run roughshod over there and destroy a bunch of tea, right? Because what is the form of tyranny, right? What are they suggesting? What form does tyranny take in relationship to liberty? Well, I would submit that if by tyranny they mean the laws and the force of law that restrains the colonists from engaging in things like tea parties in Boston Harbor and from engaging in revolutions, if that is the force of law which restrains people from engaging in those acts of criminality, if that's what tyranny is, right? Tyranny is synonymous with that which restrains liberty. I don't think that you can call that tyranny, right? If tyranny is the thing, if you're just using this word in a very euphemistic way, if you're saying tyranny, and this is what I think the authors are trying to say here, they're saying that tyranny is essentially the antithesis of liberty. Okay, fair enough. If tyranny is the antithesis of liberty, is tyranny always a bad thing? Well, that depends on how seriously you take liberty. How far does liberty go? If liberty extends to the point where it allows you to conform yourself to the principle of the Tea Party, right? Remember going back to what I said initially in the beginning of this lecture about the Tea Party principle? If you as a citizen believe that you have the right to go out there based on your own sense of moral repugnance, to go out there and to engage in criminal actions, right, in defiance of the laws of the state, right, because you subjectively believe that the state is infringing upon some inalienable right that is irrefragable and vested in you. If that is liberty, if liberty allows you to go out there and do that, and you become your own arbiter of what laws you're going to follow and what laws you're going to disregard, is that a good thing? To allow for people to go out there and say, well, liberty is essentially, the definition of liberty is allowing me as the citizen to personally, in my own mind, to arbitrate which laws I'm going to get deference to and which laws I just go out there and I don't really think that those laws are very important. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to disobey those laws because I need to disobey those laws in order to show just how opposed I am to what I ostensibly believe is an infringement upon my inalienable rights. If that is the definition of liberty, and that seems to be what the argument is here in the book, then I would say that tyranny isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you say that tyranny is the thing that constrains the exercise of pure liberty, right? Because pure liberty, as I said, going back to what I said before about unrestrained liberty, if you just have the right to go out there and act volitionally in whatever way you see fit to act, right? You go out there and engage in whatever kind of behavior you want to engage in, regardless of how it infringes upon the rights of others. Well, that's a bad thing, okay? And if tyranny is synonymous with the thing that restrains or restricts liberty and inhibits unrestricted liberty, then I would say tyranny is just another way of saying that we are a nation of laws. And there's a restraint on how far you can go in terms of what you want to do. Because if liberty is, what is the apotheosis? What is the apex, the zenith of liberty? Perfect liberty brings us to a state of nature where everybody does whatever anybody wants, okay? What everybody wants to do, okay? And you are unrestrained in what you can and cannot do because there are no laws. There's no affirmative restraint on your action. Now, again, if tyranny is the thing that holds us in place, that binds us, that constrains us from devolving into that form of absolute liberty, whereby we all have the right to go out there and do whatever we see fit, then I would argue that tyranny is not necessarily a bad thing. I would say that tyranny is a necessary thing in that context. Okay? So, and the other thing that I think the other rather strange way of expressing this is the last sentence in this paragraph here is what the authors say, but America, people by those who fled the old world in search of liberty, was a land where virtue still resided. So I think the point that they're trying to make, which is actually very ironic if you actually look at the overall theme of this book, which is very, very progressive in terms of the author's rhetoric that they use and the way they come down on various presidents. They're very this book looked as though it was written by the Joe Biden Kamala Harris campaign. Okay, the Joe Biden the Biden Kamala Harris fund was what funded the publishing of this book. Right? You could say that this is the much of how the authors come down on the stuff that lends itself to subjective interpretation anyways is consistent with that kind of worldview, and which is all the more strange when they make this statement because they say what I just said, right? They're saying that virtue essentially is the same thing as synonymous with liberty. Now think about that. Is virtue always synonymous with liberty? Right? If generally would say, I think we could make the statement that virtue is a good thing in and of itself. That's a fair statement to make. If you take virtue on its face value. The plain meaning of the word virtue is, well, what does it mean when I say you're a virtuous person? If I'm a virtuous person, it means that I'm noble. It means that I'm dignified, I'm honorable, I'm decent, I'm courageous, I have a sense of fortitude, a sense of self-restraint, right? Those are the things that are usually associated with being virtuous, right? So therefore, virtue is in and of itself a good thing. It is an absolute good thing. Now, is it fair to say that because virtue is a good thing, that we should analogize virtue with liberty? So the more virtuous you become, the better you become, right? Is by extension, therefore, is it true to say that the more liberty you have, the better off you are? Because that's the plain meaning. That's the plain meaning, as far as I can tell, anyways. That the intuitive reading, the analytical reading of that statement that the authors just made. Okay. Now, my point here is not to just go through and parse every single word that the authors state, but I think they make this point in conjunction with this issue about British tyranny. So I think it's an important point that needs to be made, right? Can we say that because virtue is an absolute good, therefore the more virtue I have, the more virtuous I am, the better I am as a person, right? The more virtuous a country is, the better it is as a country, etc. And the authors are saying that virtue is functionally synonymous with liberty. So therefore, you would have to say that, because you can say this about virtue, you have to say this about liberty as well. The more liberty I have, the better off I'm going to be, right? So I should just strive to acquire as much personal liberty as I possibly can achieve for myself. Is that a fair statement? Is that a logical statement based on everything I just said about liberty? What do we know about unrestricted, unfettered rights? Unfettered rights. You just have the right to go ahead and do whatever you want. Not the right that you can pursue your own interests so long as they don't infringe with the rights of others to pursue their own interests. Right? Not Voltaire's formulation of rights and liberty, right? But the state of nature. Does any of us really aspire to live in a state of nature? Does any of us really want to live in a place? I mean, assuming that you're not the guy who's got, who's hoarding millions of rounds of ammunition, and you're a black belt in Taekwondo, you're a fifth-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and you've got fully automatic assault rifles in your basement, etc., etc. Assuming you're not that guy, right? You're not the biggest, baddest guy in town, right? Would it be a good thing for you to live in a state of nature? Well, for most of us, for 98, 99% of the people, it would not be a good thing, because the 1% is going to completely dominate the rest of us. I happen to be in the 1%. I am the guy that's got a lot of weapons in my house, right? I'm not as big and as strong as I used to be, but I'm strong enough. But I still think it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing in principle. It's a bad thing for most people, all right? Because it would only be a good thing for a few people. And therefore, absolute liberty is not a good thing, because it's not in the best interest of the majority of the people, right? It's in the best interest of a few, a constituent subset of the people. So I think it's very important for us to look at this dynamic between tyranny of liberty in a very nuanced way, right? You cannot say, I don't want any of you saying on the exam or telling me in person or in an email or in our discussions after class that, oh yeah, liberty is always a good thing because liberty is just like virtue. Don't say that, right? That is on its face a non sequitur. I just showed you why that statement is not consonant with reason and with an analytical approach to understanding these things, right? You can say that some liberty is a good thing, to have a certain amount of liberty. Well, then the question becomes, at what point is some liberty too much liberty? Well, that's another question. That's a different question for, I think, a different day. But you can never say, well, some liberty is better than total, or some virtue is better than all virtue, or some virtue is better than a great deal of virtue. No, that's not true to say, right? So that's why I'm saying that it's not fair to say that, make the assertion that the authors, I think, explicitly well, I think they explicitly make this statement that liberty is precisely synonymous with virtue. Okay, that's, I think, all I've got for you guys today. If you have any questions, I'm going to tell you this because I told this to the history section. If you guys have any questions concerning anything I say in any of these videos, I would strongly recommend and encourage you to reach out to me. You can call me. You guys got my phone number. It's on the syllabus. It's in the emails. You can find it there. Or just send me an email, right? And say, hey, Jeff, you were a little bit ambiguous on this particular point. I'm confused as to what you meant by this particular thing, right? And I understand. As I said, I think 2 videos ago, right? The one that I think 2 of you actually bothered watching, right? But I said a lot of this stuff is not intuitive. A lot of this stuff is very nuanced. It's subtle. I get that. I understand that. I know that full well for myself, right? Because this is like taking me and putting me in an advanced math class. I never got past pre-algebra, for God's sakes, all right? You put me in calculus, I'm going to be woefully out of my league, All right, I'm not going to know what the hell's going on. I'm not even going to know what's on the board. I'm not going to be able to make any sense out of that. So I understand. Some of you may not be able to make sense of this stuff as well as I can understand it, right? That's fine. Like I said, I don't expect you all to be aspiring future lawyers, right? I don't expect that, right? But I do expect you to assimilate yourself to the main points. And I hope I'm making them in a way that is intelligible and coherent enough so that you can at least rationally understand the substance of what I'm saying, so that you can recapitulate it back to me in a meaningful way, in a way that shows that I actually am able to see that you know what you're talking about. Okay, I think that's all I've got for you guys. Be safe, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will talk to you next time. Probably via YouTube, but who knows? Maybe I'll see you in person. All right, I'll see you guys.